You're about to witness a moment that Washington never prepared for. A hearing room turned battleground, and one woman who refused to be cornered. Senator JD Vance came in with his facts, his smirk, and a plan to humiliate Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett on national television. What he didn't expect was that she came with stories, with names, with pain. Real stories that don't fit neatly on a talking point. She didn't shout. She didn't grandstand. She looked him straight in the eye and spoke with the kind of quiet fire that only comes from living the truth. This wasn't about party lines. It was about broken heaters in rural homes, eviction notices on kitchen tables, and mothers working double shifts just to keep the lights on. And what happened next would send shockwaves through every corner of America, from South Dallas to Appalachian, Ohio. If you've ever felt ignored by the system, blamed for your own struggle, or silenced by someone who's never walked a mile in your shoes, this story is for you. Before we dive in, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, have you ever been spoken over by someone who thought they knew your life better than you? Because today, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself, she defended all of us. The U.S. Senate chamber that day wasn't full, not by Capitol Hill standards, but what it lacked in crowd size, it made up for in pressure. You could feel it in the way staffers whispered behind notepads, in the shuffle of polished shoes against marble floors, and in the tight, almost performative smiles exchanged between lawmakers who knew the cameras were rolling. At the center of that quiet storm sat Senator JD Vance, Ohio suit, tie slightly loosened, and every inch the image of premeditated confidence. To his left, aides. To his right, a half-finished cup of Senate coffee and a thick binder labeled Urban Housing Mismanagement. It was clear why he was here, not just to ask questions, but to make a point, a spectacle, maybe even a soundbite for Fox by sundown. And across from him, seated under the flickering overhead lights that cast more heat than clarity, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She was calm, deliberate, her black suit jacket pressed to perfection, a small silver pin of her late father's union pinned to her lapel, a quiet rebellion against the polished machinery of DC image consultants. She wasn't just prepared, she was loaded with something far more potent than data points. She had names, she had stories. And she had lived every policy the others were only paid to debate. The agenda of the day was federal housing reform. On paper, it was policy. But everyone in that room knew it was more. It was about cities. It was about narratives. It was about who gets blamed and who gets believed. JD Vance looked ready to assign blame. He'd been tapping his pen for 10 minutes, a slow, rhythmic sound like a clock counting down. His aide leaned in and whispered something short. He nodded. And then the pen stopped. The chairwoman called the next segment. Vance straightened his notes, adjusted his mic, and leaned forward like a man preparing to pounce. "Madam Chair," he said, voice smooth, almost too measured, "I'd like to direct a question to Representative Crockett." The shift was instant. Cameras pivoted, eyebrows rose. A few aides from both sides stiffened in their seats. They'd seen this before. The performance of accountability, the theater of policy. But Crockett didn't flinch. Vance began, his tone carefully dipped in civility. "You've been vocal in your support for increasing federal housing funding in urban areas like Dallas," he said, eyes not leaving her. "But how do you reconcile that with the continued rise in violent crime, mismanagement of city resources, and persistent homelessness under the leadership in those same areas? Isn't it fair to say we should demand accountability before handing over more taxpayer dollars?" There it was, coded, sharpened. He wasn't asking about crime or spending. He was asking about competence, about character, about whether people like her, districts like hers, were capable of managing anything at all. A slow exhale moved through the chamber. Crockett's hand rested on a thick blue binder. She tapped it once, gently, then slid it closer. She didn't blink. "Senator," she began, voice low and steady, "I'm grateful you asked that question, because it lets me do what I came here to do. Not defend a statistic, but defend the people behind them." A few heads turned. She wasn't responding like someone on defense. She was stepping into something. "Let me tell you about Miss Leona," she continued. 73 years old, lives in South Dallas, has worked every day of her adult life, at a diner, then at a church, and now cleaning the lobby of a medical center where she can't afford to see a doctor. A flicker of attention sparked in the back rows. The room began to lean in. She lives in a one-bedroom apartment with black mold creeping through her vents. She's called the city. She's filed the reports. She's waited 2 years for a Section 8 voucher. Crockett paused, letting that image settle. Now tell me, Senator, she said, tilting her head slightly, when we talk about mismanagement, are we referring to her? Because she's the one holding on, not the system. Vance shifted slightly. His smirk faltered, if only for a breath. Crockett went on. And let's be honest, she said, her voice rising just a hair. The violence you mentioned didn't fall from the sky. It was built, brick by brick, policy by policy, by people who sat in rooms like this one and called it urban renewal, while bulldozing black neighborhoods into history books. It was measured, not loud, but it cut like a gavel. One staffer stopped typing. Another adjusted her glasses. On Twitter, a Junior Hill correspondent typed furiously, tagging Crockett Clapback before the speech even ended. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't aiming for Twitter. She was aiming for the gut. She leaned in just slightly, not aggressive. Not performative, just intentional. When you say our cities are broken, she said, you erase every single person fighting every single day to keep them whole. The chamber fell into a quiet, unlike anything it had known all morning. Vance inhaled slowly through his nose. His jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Crockett wasn't finished. And since you brought up taxpayer dollars, she said, flipping a page in her binder, Dallas sends over $30 billion to the federal government each year. We don't get that back. We're not asking for charity. We're asking for equity. There it was. A shift. A rift in the controlled confidence of a man who'd expected an easy target, not a counterstrike with names, numbers, and a soul. The camera lights didn't flicker, but the mood in the room did. Because whether they admitted it or not, everyone had just realized something. JD Vance had underestimated the wrong woman. And the first strike wasn't his. It was hers. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's first response wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something electric. A pause that asked everyone, whether seated in leather chairs or behind glass screens, to listen differently now. JD Vance had asked a question built to diminish, built to divide, built to spotlight urban failure, and Jasmine had turned it into a floodlight on systemic truth. But she wasn't done. She opened her binder again, but this time she wasn't looking at the pages. You know, Senator, she said, almost conversational now, I could spend the next hour giving you stats on housing, on crime, on intergenerational poverty, but numbers are a cold language. And where I come from, people speak in survival. She held up a photograph, a small, grainy image of a woman holding the hands of 2 young boys in front of a sagging duplex. This is Vanessa. She's raising her grandsons because her daughter passed from an untreated medical condition. She paused. Why untreated? Because she couldn't get Medicaid. Texas didn't expand it. And when she got sick, the clinic told her to wait 3 months. You could see the discomfort ripple across the room. Not because the story was dramatic, but because it was too real, too familiar to dismiss. Crockett leaned in again. Vanessa lives in a house with no heat, and she puts the boys in coats at night and turns on the oven to keep them warm. And you want to sit here and ask me about competence? She shook her head slowly. The federal housing program you mocked? It had a 2-year backlog in my district. Not because of fraud, but because there are more people who need help than there are funds to help them. Senator Vance opened his mouth, perhaps to pivot or push back, but the chairwoman gave no room. Let her finish, she said. Crockett nodded her thanks and continued. We talk about cities like they're experiments that failed, but we never talk about how we set them up to fail. We gutted public transit. We allowed lead to stay in water pipes. We turned a blind eye to zoning policies that redlined families out of opportunity for generations. She flipped to a new page. This one wasn't a report. It was a hand-drawn crayon letter from a child. This is from a boy named Elijah. He's 9. He wrote my office after his school shut down the library due to funding cuts. He asked if we could send books. Biu, A single breath hitched in the back row. An aide trying not to show it hit them. Elijah lives in a neighborhood where there's one grocery store for 10,000 people. One. And I will not sit here and pretend that the cause of that is local incompetence. She scanned the room. Do you know what poverty feels like? It's not just a number on a spreadsheet. It's a mother skipping dinner so her kids can eat. It's a teenager doing homework by flashlight because the electricity was cut off. It's telling your kid you can't go to the doctor because maybe it'll pass. JD Vance was still, maybe listening, maybe bracing. And Senator, she said carefully, you mentioned responsibility. You wanted to know when city leaders take responsibility. So here it is. I take it. Every single day. Every night, I read the letters. Every time I stand in front of a church group and explain why the heating assistance program ran out of money in January. She paused. But you don't get to demand responsibility from urban districts while ignoring the rot in rural ones. Appalachia is suffering too. You know that. Your constituents know that. But here's what they don't always see. That suffering has more in common with mine than you want to admit. Murmurs. Crockett raised her hand. Let me be clear. This isn't a competition. It's not city versus country. It's truth versus talking points. It's people versus systems that forgot them. She picked up a final sheet. It was folded, creased, well-worn. This is from a woman named Terry, who lives in your state. A trailer with no running water. Her message to me was simple. She said, "Thank you for saying what no one around here says out loud." Now Vance blinked. She's your constituent, Senator. She's not broken. She's not lazy. She's surviving, and she deserves better than to be used as a pawn in a policy war. Crockett folded the paper again, gently. You asked how I justify more funding for places like Dallas? Her voice dropped, not in volume, but in tone. I don't justify it. I demand it. Because we already paid for it. With our taxes, our labor, our lives. All we're asking for is the return on that investment. Silence. A kind of stillness hung in the room now, the kind that comes when someone finally says the thing everyone else has been avoiding. The chairwoman cleared her throat, but didn't speak. She didn't need to. The moment was owned, and JD Vance. He had just been handed more than a response. He had been handed a reckoning. The shift in the room was subtle, but irreversible. What had begun as a calculated line of questioning meant to embarrass Jasmine Crockett was now turning into something far more powerful, a national reframe. It wasn't just about cities anymore, not just about public housing, not even about budgets. It had become a conversation about moral courage, about neglected people in forgotten towns, and about a shared American pain that politicians love to divide but rarely dare to unify. Jasmine leaned slightly forward. Her voice remained even, a steel whisper that seemed to echo louder than any shout. Senator, she said, it would be dishonest if I stood here and said Dallas is the only place where people are suffering, because they're not. I've visited your state. I've driven through Ross County and Pike County. I've met veterans in Wheelersburg. I've sat at kitchen tables in Portsmouth with people whose stories would break your heart. She turned a page in her binder, this one tabbed with a sticky note that read, Crossroads. This is from a man named Ronnie, she said, holding up a printout of a letter. He lives in Jackson, Ohio. He's 71, a retired steelworker, lost his pension, lives off Social Security and peanut butter sandwiches. Can't afford heating oil in winter. You know what he told me? She paused, making sure Vance was looking at her. He said, Ms. Crockett, I don't care if you're red or blue. I just want to not wake up cold in February. That landed, not as a punch, but as something more intimate, a truth. She softened. That man is not a statistic. He's a mirror. And the shame is, we only seem to feel empathy when people look like us, live near us, or vote like us. That has to stop. The fake. A flicker of discomfort crossed Vance's expression. You say urban poverty is a failure of leadership, she said, her voice gathering strength. Then what do we call it when people in rural towns can't access clean water, when broadband doesn't reach their homes, when maternity wards close and mothers give birth in ambulances? She held the silence. Let me say it clearly. Rural pain deserves the same outrage as urban pain, but we don't get to weaponize one against the other. The room was watching Vance now to see what he would do. He didn't move, didn't speak. So Crockett continued. Senator, she said gently, I read your voting record. You voted against the Rural Housing Stability Assistance Program. That bill would have helped families in trailer parks, in old mining towns, in places where the lights go out and don't come back on. That wasn't a partisan bill. That was a lifeline. And you said no. She looked straight at him. So don't ask me why I fight for cities. Ask yourself why you didn't fight for your own counties. The chairwoman's pen stopped moving. A few staffers were no longer taking notes. They were just watching. You know who's tired, Senator? Crockett asked. Everyone. The grandmother in Cleveland, the ex-coal worker in Athens, the single mom in Dallas, the Iraq veteran living in his truck outside Columbus. They're tired of being spoken about but never spoken for. Then she dropped her voice, almost to a hush. And they're tired of leaders who show up for a headline, but not for a hospital ribbon cutting, who take pictures in front of shuttered plants and then vote against the funding that could have saved them. She flipped to the final page. You wanted accountability? She asked. Here it is. I'm accountable to everyone who writes me, no matter what they look like, where they live, or who they vote for. Can you say the same? The silence in the chamber deepened, not empty, not awkward, but heavy with something unspoken, maybe regret, maybe respect, maybe recognition. And outside, the reaction was already lighting up. Newsrooms scrambled to transcribe her words. A clip of her comparing Ronnie and Jackson to a grandmother in South Dallas hit 1.5 million views in 42 minutes. One tweet read, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend the poor, she united them. And at that moment, in that hearing room, with old portraits on the walls and an American flag fluttering above, something had shifted. The old lines didn't hold. This wasn't about urban or rural anymore. It was about who was hurting, and who was finally brave enough to say both. Jasmine Crockett closed her binder. For the first time since she began speaking, her hands left the table and folded softly in front of her. Her gaze shifted, not just to JD Vance, but past him, past the panel, past the cameras, to something quieter, deeper. There's something I've never said in this room, she said, voice gentler now. Something I usually keep private because people don't like when you get personal in politics. But I think it's time. A flicker moved through the chamber, the kind of shift that doesn't rustle papers or flash lights. It changes posture, air, intention. I was 13 years old, she began, when I learned what eviction felt like. She didn't rush. She didn't dramatize. She spoke like someone opening a photo album that still hurt to touch. It was winter. My mom worked at a corner store during the day and cleaned offices at night. My dad had just been laid off from the auto body shop. We were behind on rent. 1 month, then 2. She inhaled quietly. We came home from school and our furniture was on the lawn, just sitting there, couch, boxes. My little brother thought we were moving. He smiled, said, "Where are we going next?" You could hear someone in the chamber take a breath. Slow, shaky. We weren't moving. We were being erased. A long pause. That night, we stayed with a neighbor. For 2 weeks, we bounced from couch to couch. And all the while, my mom went to work like nothing happened. She smiled at customers. She said, "Have a good day," when no one said it back. Jasmine's eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't crack. But the weight in her chest traveled down every row. I remember watching her bandage her feet at night, blisters from standing too long in cheap shoes. I asked her once why we didn't just ask for help. She said, "Because they already think we're a burden." Her words hit like confession. "So, no, Senator," she said, tone rising ever so slightly. "I'm not new to this fight. I didn't come here to score points. I came because I've lived what your constituents are living. And I've watched people like you turn them into punchlines instead of priorities." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. Slowly, carefully, she unfolded it. "This is the eviction notice I found in a file box when I was 24, helping my mom go through old papers. She kept it, not out of shame, but as a reminder." The paper was old, creased, faded, but the date was still legible. 1999. It reminds her that no matter how hard you work, how many hours you clock, someone in a suit can still decide your story doesn't matter, that you're just a number, just another name on a docket. Crockett looked out at the panel again. That's why I ran for office. That's why I fight for cities. That's why I lose sleep when a grant gets denied or a program gets cut. She leaned in again. Because when you've been humiliated at the curb in front of your neighbors, when you've had your childhood stuffed into a trash bag because the landlord changed the locks, you never forget. A pause. You never stop hearing your little brother ask, "Did we do something wrong?" She sat back slightly, letting the memory rest where it landed. Across the room, Senator Pauline Marks's hand hovered over her notepad. She didn't write, she only watched. You know who else I met this year? Jasmine said softly. A woman in Lancaster, Texas. She was 67. Her home was condemned last fall. She had nowhere to go. She kept all her things in a grocery cart. And you know what she asked me? Not for money. Not for a hotel. She paused. She asked me if she still mattered. That line didn't echo. It settled, like dust in sunlight. So when I sit in this seat, Crockett continued, voice firm now, and I hear colleagues say cities are broken, or urban folks are to blame, or that government aid is just a crutch, I don't hear policy disagreement. She stared hard at JD Vance. I hear you telling that woman she doesn't matter. He didn't look away, but he didn't respond either. And I won't let that stand. She reached for her water, took a sip, and let the silence do what words no longer needed to. The hearing room was quiet, not the kind of silence that follows a speech, but the kind that remains when the truth has taken up residence. No one reached for their water. No one checked their watch. The gavel wasn't raised. The moment didn't end because the system allowed it to. It ended because Jasmine Crockett had said everything that needed to be said. JD Vance's face was unreadable now. The polished confidence from earlier had faded. He blinked. Once. Then lowered his gaze to the notes he never touched again. The room exhaled slowly. Staffers shifted in their seats, their pens still. Reporters stopped typing. Even the chairwoman sat frozen, her hands clasped in front of her, her breath shallow. A small voice, barely above a whisper, broke the tension. That was something, a senior staffer muttered, not to anyone in particular. And then, like a current rippling outward, the world began to react. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's testimony hit the internet before she even stood up. Uploaded first by a congressional intern on their personal TikTok, it showed her saying, "We weren't moving. We were being erased." It reached 300,000 views in the first hour. By midday, that line became a movement. Isaur, "We were being erased," trended nationally. On Instagram, people began posting photos of their old eviction notices, childhood neighborhoods, water-damaged apartments, and letters they never sent to local officials. One man in Detroit shared a video saying, "I've never voted in my life, but if people like her are showing up, maybe it's time I do." On Twitter, a conservative veteran from rural Kentucky wrote, "I don't agree with Rep's Crockett on a lot, but she's the first person I've seen in that room who understands what it's like to be poor with dignity." Jasmine didn't speak to the media immediately. She left the chamber with quiet nods from colleagues, a whispered "thank you" from the chairwoman, and no prepared remarks for reporters. She walked through the marbled hall, down the Senate steps, and got into her car without a soundbite. But the nation kept talking. On the 6 p.m. news, anchors showed her folded eviction notice and called it a moment that will define the 119th Congress. One network split the screen. On one side, JD Vance questioning competence. On the other, Jasmine answering with memory, truth, and grief. In South Dallas, a muralist started painting her silhouette on a brick wall next to a quote, "She asked me if she still mattered." In Chillicothe, Ohio, a retired miner named Terry called into a radio station and said, "That woman spoke more truth in 1 hour than my senator has in a decade." But it wasn't just fans. It wasn't just praise. It was awakening. In the days that followed, a petition gained momentum calling for a joint bipartisan town hall on housing policy in a trailer park in Ohio. Thousands signed, some signed anonymously, some wrote in bold letters. Because poor is poor. And somebody finally said it out loud. Even members of Congress who rarely crossed the aisle reached out quietly. One Republican rep from Kansas texted her, "You got to something deeper. Not sure I agree with all of it, but I felt it." And that was the point. Jasmine Crockett didn't win a debate that day. She changed the terms of engagement. She reminded Washington what it was supposed to sound like when someone spoke on behalf of people who never got invited into the room. In a follow-up interview weeks later, a journalist asked her, "Did you know your story would go viral?" Jasmine smiled faintly. "No," she said, "but I hoped someone who needed it would hear it." She looked at the camera. Someone sitting at home with a shut-off notice. Someone wondering if the eviction was their fault. Someone ashamed of being poor. Someone who's been surviving so long they forgot what hope felt like. She paused, then added, "I spoke because I needed them to know they're not alone, and they still matter." And maybe that's what this story is really about. Not just about Crockett, not just about JD Vance, but about who gets heard and who gets remembered. Because for too long, America has divided its compassion like a pie chart. Rural poor here, urban poor there, working class over here, single moms over there, veterans here, disabled folks there. Like survival comes with categories. But what Crockett did that day was erase those lines. She said the quiet thing, the thing people feel in grocery store aisles, in church basements, and broken down buses. That we're all closer to each other than we are to the people making the rules. That dignity has no party, that hardship isn't lazy, that just because someone's never seen you doesn't mean you don't exist. And maybe that's why her words hit so hard, because they weren't rehearsed, they weren't marketed. They were lived, they were remembered, they were America. So if this story touched something inside you, a memory, a truth, a name you haven't said out loud in years, don't let it end here. Share it, talk about it, leave a comment below. Tell us what Washington forgot to ask you, because sometimes the loudest thing in the room is the silence after someone finally tells the truth.